So let me get started. By the way, my background is not my real background. It's just where I wish I was. Anyway, this little talk that I'm going to give you is about the origins, history, and importance of Hebrew. And to get started, we have to go really, really far back. This talk is going to take us all the way back to a time before there was a Jewish people to discover where the Hebrew alphabet and all of the Western writing systems came from. We're also going to consider what language was like for the tribes of Israel and the surrounding nations, and then examine how the Hebrew language came to be the center of our identity in the Babylonian exile. Then briefly, I'm going to stop and consider the importance of Hebrew in the Maccabean Revolt and in the establishment of the Hasmonean Kingdom, and move on from there to talk about how Hebrew language texts preserved the Jewish people through 2,000 years of the Diaspora. And finally, examine how Hebrew came to be chosen as the language of modern Israel and how it was successfully revived, more successfully so than probably any other language in human history. So that's these are the 6 stops on this train. And we're going to start with the first stop, which is before Moses. Because to understand the origins of Western writing systems, we have to look all the way back to ancient Egyptian during the times when hieroglyphic writing was prevalent. What you see here is an example of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The panel on the left-hand side of the slide represents a sample of Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. To understand how it worked, let's focus on the top 4 symbols in that panel, which combine to form a word. The word in question is the name of the Egyptian goddess Aset, which is also popularly known as Isis. Now, if you take these pieces apart, the top left element is a pictograph of a throne, which is used here as a phonetic element to represent the consonants S and T, indicating that the name contains those 2 consonants. The top right element, the gray semicircle, is a pictograph of a loaf of bread, but it's also used here as a phonetic element to reinforce the fact that the word ends with a T. It also invokes the meaning of female. The yellow oval on the left, below the loaf of bread, is a pictograph of an egg and indicates that the name is female. And below these 3 symbols is a pictograph of a goddess, which indicates that the female name in question is the name of a goddess. So if you puzzle it all out, the reader of this hieroglyph would come to understand that it represents the name of the female goddess whose name contains the consonants S and T and which ends with T. In other words, the goddess Aset. So now you understand how hieroglyphics work. And we're not going to talk about hieroglyphics anymore because that's the source. The Phoenician alphabet itself can be traced back to the Egyptian system, but it was actually adopted by the Phoenicians from some Canaanite tribes living in the Sinai Peninsula, who had independently developed a phonetic alphabet based on symbols used in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, it was in 1905 in the mountains of southwestern Sinai, in an area known as Serbit el-Khadem, which isn't far from the Gulf of Suez, that a set of inscriptions was discovered dating from the mid-19th century BCE. That's about 3,800 years ago. These inscriptions were written in a Proto-Canaanite alphabet and were hypothesized to have been written by Canaanites who were involved in the mining and transport of turquoise from Sinai into Egypt. So having come into contact with the Egyptians in their writing, the Canaanites at Serbit el-Khadem borrowed some of the more common pictographic symbols found in Egyptian hieroglyphs and adapted them to represent the sounds of their own language. In this case, they utilized each of the symbols to represent the first sound of the Canaanite word represented by the pictograph. Okay? So this table shows how it all worked. For example, if you take the Egyptian pictograph for house, which is the second to last symbol in the top row, since the Canaanite word for house was bet, they used this symbol for writing the first sound in that word, the sound b or b. And they called the letter bet, that is house. Note that it's still called bet in Hebrew today, and it appears as the last syllable of the English word alphabet. The last symbol in the row is similar. The symbol is an Egyptian pictograph of an ox, actually an ox head. The Canaanite word for ox was alp, beginning with a glottal stop. The Canaanites thus used this symbol for writing the first sound in that word, the glottal stop, and they called the letter Aleph, meaning ox. The letter is called Aleph in Hebrew today and appears again as the first part of the word alphabet. If we look at the full system, and this slide shows the full Phoenician alphabet as adapted from the Sinai Canaanites, the Phoenician letter on the left, and then you have the name of the letter in the middle, and then you have the sound it represents on the right. Okay, and you can see that many of the Phoenician letters already have the same shapes that we're familiar with from Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. For instance, looking at the left-hand column, we see the Aleph having the appearance of an A turned sideways. And the Gimel, Dalet, and He have the shapes of Greek, Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon. On this slide, I'm showing you the progressive evolution of Aleph Alpha over the course of 3,000 years, beginning as a hieroglyphic pictograph of an ox some 5,000 years ago, adopted in an abbreviated form as the letter Alp by the Canaanites of the Sinai, then adapted into the Phoenician writing system as the more abstract-looking Aleph. And from there, it became an alpha for the Greeks, and ultimately the Latin letter A. We should remember here in passing that the alphabet of the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and all the rest of the Semitic Canaanite peoples only had letters representing consonants. This is because Semitic languages have a system of consonantal roots, whereby a string of consonants, usually 3, carries a basic meaning, and vowels are added around the consonants to create from them nouns, verbs, and adjectives. For instance, the 3 consonants KTB or KTB are associated with books and writing, such that Kitab means book in Arabic and Kotev means write in Hebrew. Now, it was the Greeks with their very different language who needed vowels for their writing system. Accordingly, the Semitic Aleph became the vowel alpha or A. The He became epsilon or E. The Yod became iota or I, and the Ayin became omicron or O. So now let's see where it gets. Now we get into biblical Israel. Let's consider what the language was like, what the Hebrew language was like for the tribes of Israel and the other nations that surrounded them. Well over 3,000 years ago, the Israelites established themselves in Canaan. First as a confederation of 12 tribes. This is during the period of Judges. Then as the kingdom of Israel, ruled by kings Saul, David, and Solomon. And later as the kingdom of Israel in the north and a kingdom of Judah in the south. All during this time, the Israelites were surrounded by other peoples and tribes who all spoke languages that were closely related to Hebrew. South of Judah was Edom. The Bible describes the Edomites as descendants of Esau, the elder son of Isaac. The Moabites and Ammonites, according to biblical account, are descendants of Moab and Ammon, two brothers who were born to Lot out of incest with his own daughters. Note that the book of Ruth testifies to close relations between Moab and the tribe of Judah. Also, by his descent from Ruth, David may be said to have had Moabite blood in his veins. Now, these Canaanite languages included Ammonite, Edomite, Hebrew, Moabite, and Phoenician. And together with Aramaic, they formed a subgroup of very closely related languages in the Northwest Semitic language family. With only one exception, all of the Canaanite languages were written in a variant of the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenician alphabet itself gave rise to 2 daughter scripts, Old Hebrew and Aramaic. Aramaic, in turn, gave rise to the Ammonite and Edomite scripts. But not every Canaanite language developed its own script, however. Moabite, for instance, was written using Old Hebrew. And the figure on this slide shows examples of some of the alphabetic scripts used to write the Canaanite languages, with Hebrew on the bottom there. Now, more than sharing an alphabet, Moabite and Israelite Hebrew were closely related, with the 2 nations sharing a border and sharing in conflict. It was sometime around 840 BCE that King Mesha of Moab successfully rebelled against subjugation by the kingdom of Israel and defeated what he called the House of David, which was Judah. On this occasion, King Mesha had a commemorative stone tablet inscribed in order to record the event. Now, the text of this 2,900-year-old tablet would have been comprehensible both to the Moabites, the people who wrote it, and also to the surrounding Israelite tribes. The sample text shown here from the tablet, written in a modified ancient Hebrew script, bears the words, Et Naba al Yisrael, take Naba against Israel. So you can see that the Moabite language in its writing was very, very similar to Israelite Hebrew. Knowing how closely related the Canaanite languages were, it shouldn't be surprising to speakers of these. It should be surprising that speakers of these could communicate with each other quite readily, much as speakers of British, Indian, and American English can all communicate with each other today. We can easily imagine this to be so in the story of Ruth, which describes Elimelech from the tribe of Judah moving with his wife Naomi and sons Machlon and Chilion to Moab on account of a famine on his side of the Jordan River. In this story, Elimelech dies and his two sons marry Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. Later, Naomi's sons die, and she decides to return to Judah, telling her daughters-in-law to return to their own families. It's here that Ruth famously tells Naomi that she will accompany her back to Judah, saying, I will go where you go, live where you live, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Now, in this story, one assumes that the main protagonists each spoke their own language, Hebrew for Naomi and Moabite for Ruth, but that they easily understood each other. Now, just as we can surmise the likely mutual intelligibility of Hebrew and Moabite, we also know that the Hebrew spoken by the different tribes wasn't uniform. This is to say, the different Israelite tribes spoke distinct dialects of Hebrew. This is attested in the story from the book of Judges relating the aftermath of a battle between the tribes of Ephraim and Gilead. Gilead is the eastern half of the tribe of Manasseh. Here, the Gileadites set up sentries on the Jordan River to stop fleeing Ephraimites from crossing over. Now, it happens that where Gileadites pronounce the sound sh in certain words, Ephraimites would substitute a s sound in those same words. In this case, the word for an ear of grain happened to be pronounced shibboleth by the Gileadite speakers and sibboleth by the Ephraimite speakers. And on this basis, Gileadite sentries identified fleeing Ephraimite soldiers and killed them. Now, summing up what we know from this, besides the killing of Ephraimites, is that during the period of Judges in the Kingdom of Israel, Hebrew was one of a group of closely related and somewhat mutually intelligible languages and dialects. So now let's turn to Persian rule, because this is where we find how Hebrew language came to stand out and apart from the rest of the Canaanite languages and became the core of the Jewish people's identity. Sometime between 597 and 586 BCE, following the Babylonian conquest of the Kingdom of Judah, the Jews, or at least their key leaders and families, were exiled from the conquered kingdom to Babylon. Some 40 to 60 years later, after the Babylonian Empire itself was conquered and replaced by a Persian one, the Jews were returned to the land of Israel and reestablished themselves there along with their temple and ritual observances. The First Persian Empire relied on Aramaic being a regional lingua franca to administer the Tigris-Euphrates region to the west of Persia proper. Old Persian and Greek also figured as official languages. Now, it was during the experience of this exile that the Hebrew-speaking Jewish exiles first found themselves in a completely foreign place, surrounded by profoundly different peoples and languages. One might speculate that it was here that their consciousness of being different, distinct from all those around them, crystallized, and that in this place they saw their language as what made them different. It's no surprising then that it was under Persian sponsorship of Jewish return from exile and the rebuilding of their temple that we find this first textual references to language, Hebrew word lashon, as being synonymous with people, the Hebrew word am. Prior to this, peoples are understood to have languages, but the word language is not used in place of people. Here in the book of Esther, we're told that letters were sent out to each people in their own language. Given that Aramaic was an official language of the Persian Empire and that everyone understood it, the only reason for sending to Jews, for example, a letter written in Hebrew using Hebrew characters would be to identify them and acknowledge them as a separate people through their language. The Jewish prayers now recited daily were composed during this, following the end of the Babylonian exile. And it is in these prayers that the passage about being chosen from all the nations is found. Bachartanu mikol ha'amim, right? And to this prayer, but only on the 5 major festivals, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, this extra passage in red is added, saying that we were raised up from all the languages. And here it's transparently clear that language and people are synonymous, that language is an identifier or a synonym for people. So the importance of Hebrew now in the Maccabean Revolt and the establishment of the Hasmonean Kingdom can't be overstated, going on from the Persian exile. It's in this time that the Hebrew language and the traditions that it represented came to the fore in an armed conflict with and as a counterpoint to the prevailing Greek language and its culture. Initially, at least, and this is the Seleucid Empire, the empire which followed on the Alexander's empire, the Seleucids respected the cultural and religious sensibilities of their subjects, but preferred to rely on Greek or Macedonian soldiers and administrators for the day-to-day business of governing. Now, fighting the Parthians in the east, the Ptolemies in the south, and the Romans in the west, that led to a weakening of the empire, and also to fear of internal rebellion. And out of the repression born from this fear came a Jewish revolt. Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, who was Seleucus' brother, in the latter part of his reign, saw a further disintegration of his empire. And imagining that the Jews were about to rebel against his rule, Antiochus began a brutal campaign of repression against the Jews and their religious practices. And this had the result of provoking exactly the armed rebellion he was trying to avoid. It should also be noted that modern scholarship considers the Maccabean Revolt less an uprising against foreign oppression than as a civil war between Orthodox and reformist parties in the Jewish camp. That is, between those who opposed Antiochus's religious repression and those who were prepared to go along with it. Here again, we find textual reasons, primarily in the book of Daniel, to think that language, lashon, is elevated as a marker of national identity. The book of Daniel, which is written partly in Aramaic and partly in Hebrew, relates events dating from the Babylonian exile, early in the 6th century BCE, and recounts acts of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed and pillaged Jerusalem. Now, being that the book of Daniel itself was composed about 400 years after this historical fact, around 165 BC, right in the midst of the Jewish revolt against the Seleucid Empire, it's reasonable to imagine that references to the wicked Babylonian king who destroyed Jerusalem might be not so oblique allusions to Antiochus, against whom the Jews were waging a war of national liberation. It's significant then that that the text equates as synonymous the terms people, Aramaic nation, Aramaic and language, Aramaic lishan. And it does so no less than 6 separate times. Now, in the year 37 BCE, came the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the end of Jewish national self-determination for the next 1985 years, until the establishment of independence in the modern state of Israel. Throughout nearly 2,000 years of the diaspora, it was the Hebrew language and the Hebrew texts that it enshrined, which sustained and preserved the Jewish people. Without the language and without its texts, Jews would likely have disappeared completely as a people. Through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, the Hebrew language was not much used as a language of daily conversation as it had been in biblical times. However, the language was not by any means dead, as were Hittite and ancient Egyptian. It was still very much in use as a classical language of study, prayer, and other intellectual pursuits. Observant Jews were minimally capable of reading Hebrew orthography and understanding the meaning of Hebrew prayers in the Hebrew Bible. More erudite members of the community would also use it for written communication in books, letters, and legal documents. And even though Jews didn't use Hebrew as a first language for communication, they could speak it on occasion. Jews from different countries are known to have conversed with each other in Hebrew. Visiting scholars gave sermons in it. Some spoke it on Sabbaths and festivals, while others spoke it in order not to be understood by the Gentiles. In these respects, the role of Hebrew among Jews was very much like that of Latin in medieval Catholic Europe, or Byzantine Greek and Old Church Slavonic and Orthodox Christian Eastern Europe, or Classical Arabic in the Muslim Southwest Asia and Northern Africa. Now, it should be said here that Hebrew and its texts were a threat to Christian hegemony, and also to the basic precepts of Christianity itself. And Hebrew and these texts were more of a threat than the Jews who spoke it. Restrictions on Hebrew texts and attempts to destroy them began very early in Christian Europe. It was the Roman Empire Emperor Constantine who made Christianity the official religion of the empire in the year 380. Less than 200 years later, in the year 553, Emperor Justinian forbade the teaching of the Mishnah, which is the first, 2nd century Hebrew codification of Jewish oral law. And in 712, the Visigoths in Spain forbade converts to Christianity from reading Hebrew books. Now, the step from banning to burning was a very short one. Suppression of rationalist tendencies in 13th century Europe led to the 1233 burning of Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. And although the connection between burning the guide and the later burning of the Talmud is tenuous, a dangerous precedent had been set. In 1236, a Jewish apostate submitted to Pope Gregory IX a list of 35 charges against the Talmud. After a preliminary investigation, Gregory sent a letter ordering the confiscation of Jewish books, and in 1242, 24 wagon loads containing thousands of volumes were burned in the public spaces. This went on for more than 5 centuries, with the last Talmud burning taking place in Poland in 1757, when Bishop Nicholas Dembowski condemned all copies of the Talmud in his diocese to be burned after being dragged through the streets in mockery. In this instance, nearly 1,000 copies of the Talmud were thrown into a pit and burned. Now, during the 19th century, the use of common vernacular to convey realism in literature and the rise of European nationalism worked both against and for the Hebrew revival. On the negative side, biblical Hebrew's limited and somewhat vague vocabulary was seen as an anachronism for Jews who aspired to the nationality and the national languages of the countries that they lived in. It was also a poor vehicle for realistic and modern expression compared to national vernaculars. At the same time, for Jews who had national or who had Jewish national aspirations inspired that way by their European contemporaries, Hebrew was a linguistic emblem that could be used to express and cradle those aspirations. So now we turn to the story of how Hebrew was chosen as the language of modern Israel and successfully revived as the living language of the Jewish people. As I said, more successfully than probably any other language in human history. The rise of 19th century European nationalism, combined with the ongoing brutal Jew hate throughout the Christian world, helped to spark at the end of the 1800s a movement for Jewish national self-determination, Zionism. Aspirations for political self-determination involved the establishment of a modern state in the land of Israel, Eretz Israel. And alongside this was the imperative for cultural self-determination, which entailed having a national language. Now, that said, Hebrew as the choice, as the language of a modern Jewish nation, as that choice was not a straightforward one. The establishment of other national languages, such as German and Greek, involved choosing from several regional dialects and then simply promoting one as a national standard. This wasn't possible in the case of modern Hebrew. Jews prior to the 20th century, as I've already said, had come to speak dozens of local languages scattered throughout Europe, North Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And they also used regional Judeo languages, such as Yiddish, Judeo-German, Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic, and Judeo-Persian. And while Hebrew was used for liturgical purposes, it wasn't anyone's first language. So a national cultural identity using Hebrew as its foundation would have to be recreated out of the historical textual record. Now, it's worth pointing out that for hundreds of years, there was no special area within the Ottoman Empire corresponding to Palestine or Israel. The area spanning from north of Egypt through Syria was mostly undifferentiated region of Levantine Arabic speakers And the internal political boundaries of the Ottoman Empire attest to this. They were borders of political convenience, administrative convenience, and they were frequently redrawn over the course of 500 years of Ottoman history. In the 1609 map here, the general area of Eretz Israel is divided between two Ottoman ayalets, one with Cairo as its center and the other with Damascus. 200 years later, in 1695, the Ottomans, having lost some territory in the Balkans and the Arabian Peninsula, and gained some territory in North Africa, we see Eretz Israel, again circled, as partitioned among four different ayalets. Now, by 1900, with the Ottomans having lost control of North Africa, Arabia, Greece, and most of the Balkans, we see an internal division in which Eretz Israel is mostly contained in one district. However, even in this period, there's no Ottoman recognition of anything that approximates an Israel or a Palestine, as this pre-World War I 1915 map shows. The Vilayet of Beirut encompasses all of modern-day Israel north of Jerusalem, with central Israel and Galil divided into the sanjaks of Balka and Akkad. Most of the area south of this, including Jerusalem, Hebron, and the Negev, is allocated to an independent sanjak of Jerusalem. During World War I, European powers commenced to plan a carving up of the Ottoman Empire, with England and France taking the lead. Sir Mark Sykes and Francois-Georges Picot were appointed by the British and French to apportion the Ottoman territories, and in their initial plans, which were never implemented, most of southern Israel would have been placed under British control, and the northern half would have come under international control. Now, as it turned out, the British created under League of Nations authority an administrative unit called Palestine in 1922, comprising all of modern Israel and Jordan. It was this area in which the British government and League of Nations, following the Balfour Declaration of 1917, promised to allow the creation of a Jewish homeland. So, fast forward to 1947. Following decades of Arab resistance to Jewish immigration, World War II, and the Holocaust, the United Nations approved the partition plan for a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Hebrew and Arabic as their respective national languages. Now, you might say that history could have turned out differently if Jewish immigrants to Eretz Israel had kept their own languages, or had become another Arabic-speaking religious community in the region. And it might be said thereby that the revival of Hebrew as a national language was as important to the creation of a distinct national identity for Israel as was the religion that this new state was intended to support and protect. As we've said, the selection of Hebrew as the national language was not a foregone conclusion, even though the determination of the Jewish immigrants to construct a nation based on language was. There was, in fact, a robust debate on whether to adopt Yiddish or to revive Hebrew, with the latter winning out for being seen as more authentically and historically Jewish. Zionist leaders were primarily from Eastern Europe, where Yiddish held sway as the language of Jews. Further, European Jews had developed a rich tradition of Yiddish literature, song, and folklore, much richer than that of Hebrew, which had primarily been a vehicle for liturgical and scholastic traditions. The prevalence of Yiddish among European Jews thus made it a natural candidate for the language of Jewish national self-determination. However, there was significant opposition to Yiddish. Many of those aspiring to establish a Jewish homeland saw Yiddish as a language of exile, the language of a people without a land. And in the debate between supporters of the diasporic language of convenience and supporters of the ancient language of Israel, it was the latter that won out. Now, one of those who led the Hebrew Restoration movement, in fact, the principal person who led the Hebrew Restoration movement, was Eliezer ben Yehuda, known as the reviver of modern Hebrew. In 1879, in an article, ben Yehuda wrote this. He said, if a language is to be taken on the European model as a criterion of nationalism and nationhood, we have a language in which we can write everything we want, and we can speak it if we only want to. And that language is Hebrew. So beginning with ben Yehuda's arrival in Palestine in 1881, the Hebrew language revival program was so successful that by the end of World War I, fully 40% of the Jewish population in the country used Hebrew as their first or daily language, including more than 3/4 of the children. It was Cecil Roth who summed up ben Yehuda's contribution to the Hebrew language, saying, before ben Yehuda, Jews could speak Hebrew. After him, they did. Thank you. That's it.